Welcome back to the Sovereign Sphere podcast. I'm your host, Carla Treadway, and today we're going to be pulling back the curtain on what has stumped Canada's growth for the last 50 years. And this is not a conspiracy theory. This is documented history pulled from academic journals, government records, and the Club of Rome's own publications. By the end of this episode, you're going to understand exactly why Canada is where it is today. The housing crisis, the energy restrictions, the immigration pressure, the economic stagnation. None of it is an accident. Today, we're talking about Pierre Trudeau, the Club of Rome, and the deliberate, systematic degrowth of Canada. Now, this episode will be particularly interesting to those of you who saw clips from the latest NDP rally and a glimpse into the communist and socialist nature of many Canadians and why that's a huge danger to our future. Buckle up. This one is going to go deep. You might even want to take notes. Before we go back in time, let's talk about what's happening right now, because the present is the proof. If you've been paying attention to Canadian politics, you've noticed something deeply unsettling building beneath the surface. There's a coordinated narrative being pushed across Canadian media and social media about empty bedrooms. Now, on the surface, that sounds like a housing conversation, but if you look closer, the pressure being applied, particularly on elderly Canadians, grandparents, people who have lived in their homes for decades, is to downsize, to give up their multi-bedroom homes, to make room for others deemed more deserving. I've even heard Olivia Chow suggest that people turn their homes into apartment buildings. This is not a housing policy, this is housing reform, in the same sense that Mao Zedong used the term land reform in China in the 90s. In China, land reform meant the seizure and redistribution of private property. It meant destroying the existing ownership class. It meant collectivization, and it meant mass death. 1 in 6 Chinese citizens may have died as a direct result of Mao's programs. Now, they're not sending soldiers to your door yet. Instead, they are running what the Chinese Communist Party perfected and called the mass line. The mass line is a propaganda technique where the government manufactures a demand, presents it as a grassroots movement, and then uses the illusion of public consensus to implement the policy that they always intended to impose. So the masses didn't demand it. The party created the demand, they packaged it, and they handed it back to the masses as their own idea. Sound familiar? And here's the key cultural weapon being used against Canadians specifically. As one Canadian told me in the United States, the cultural identity is I'm an American, I'm awesome. But in Canada, it's we're Canadians, we are awesome. That collective identity, that beautiful Canadian sense of community is actually being weaponized. The we is being used to extract compliance. Your sense of national belonging is being turned into a tool of coercion. That's where we're at today. But to understand how we got here, we have to go way back. And James Lindsay is going to help me a lot with this episode. The Club of Rome was founded in April 1968 when an Italian industrialist named Aurelio Pecci and a Scottish scientist named Alexander King, who was the Director General for Scientific Affairs at the OECD, brought together 20 leading industrialists, academics, and bureaucrats at the Villa Farnese in Rome. Now, the meeting was, by Pecci and King's own admission, a total disaster. But one participant, a systems thinker named Eric Janst, had outlined a framework for understanding what they called the problématique. The problématique. Remember that word. It's the heart of everything that's about to follow. The problématique was the idea that all of the world's major problems, overpopulation, environmental destruction, resource depletion, urban pollution, social discontent, they're not separate issues. They were all interconnected and they were part of one giant system. Therefore, they required one giant coordinated global solution. Now, on the surface, that sounds reasonable, but here's where it gets really sinister. Because if all problems are interconnected and systemic, then the only solution is a systems approach. And a systems approach requires someone to be in charge of the system. Someone to model it, someone to manage it, someone to pull the levers. And who would that be? The Club of Rome. They're partners at the World Economic Forum, which was founded that same year, 1971, and has been cross-pollinating with the Club of Rome from day one, the United Nations, and their various government puppets installed in the capitals of all Western nations. Now, this is not speculation. Klaus Schwab himself bragged about the Club of Rome's involvement in the West's early years in his 2011 book, The World Economic Forum, The First 40. Now, what is the Club of Rome's actual agenda? It's neo-Malthusian degrowth communism. Let me break that down. Malthus was an 18th century economist who argued that population growth would always outpace food production, leading to inevitable collapse. He was wrong then. The Club of Rome updated his ideas with computers and then they called it science. In 1972, the Club of Rome published their landmark document, The Limits to Growth, which used MIT computer models with 5 variables: population, food production, industrialization, pollution, and the consumption of non-renewable natural resources. Their conclusion, without dramatic intervention, the world would experience sudden and uncontrollable decline in both population and industrial capacity by the early 21st century. They predicted we would run out of copper by the year 2000. They predicted mass starvation. They predicted civilizational collapse. Well, none of it happened. Not one of their major predictions came true by their own deadlines. So what did they do? They rewrote the models. They published a second edition, and then a third, and then a fourth. And now, in May 2024, they published a document called Earth for All, Deep Dive Paper 17, which is essentially the 5th iteration of the same failed predictions. Maybe there's even another one now. And every single time they publish a new version, the World Economic Forum jumps on it. The United Nations builds it into their Sustainable Development Agenda, and their government puppets implement it as policy. This is their method. And Canada has been participating in it before it was even built. Now here's where it gets personal for Canadians. In 2022, the Canadian Journal of History, Volume 57, Issue 2, published a paper by a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Waterloo named Christopher Orr. The paper is titled Environmental Aspirations in an Unsettled Time. Pierre Elliott Trudeau, the Club of Rome, and Canadian Environmental Politics in the 1970s. This paper is extraordinary, and it has been almost completely ignored by mainstream Canadian media. I mean, doesn't surprise me. What Orr documents using government records, memos, and first-hand accounts is that Pierre Trudeau met with the Club of Rome at least 3 times before the Department of Environment was even created in 1971. So let me highlight that. The Club of Rome was shaping Canadian environmental governance before Canada even had an environment department. So here's the timeline. So in late 1967, Pecci and King meet and begin formulating the problématique. April 1968, the Club of Rome holds its founding meeting in Rome. Trudeau is elected Prime Minister of Canada in the same year, riding the wave of Trudeau mania. 15th to 16th, 1969, members of the Club of Rome, including Pecci and King, first meet with Pierre Trudeau and members of the Canadian government. This meeting included representatives from the Prime Minister Office, the Privy Council Office, the Science Secretariat, the Development of External Affairs, the Department of National Defense, and Senator Maurice Lamontagne. At an informal dinner on June 16th, Pecci and King argued, and I'm quoting here, that nothing short of a comprehensive systems approach on a worldwide basis can be fully effective. Pecci then made a specific request. He asked Pierre Trudeau to take the primary initiative in launching global efforts to address the problématique. He said Canada was the best imaginable choice because it had an untarnished record. Trudeau was known to be open-minded. Other countries looked to Canada for leadership, and Canada was considered a country of independent thinking in a constructive sense. So in other words, Pecci looked at Canada and said, "You are the perfect vehicle for our agenda, maybe even a testing ground. You're trusted, you're respected, and your Prime Minister, he's already on board." And Trudeau's advisors agreed. A program secretary to the Prime Minister named J.M. Davey recommended that Canada support the Club of Rome's proposal, arguing that the proposed problems were real and that this approach fits very well with the nature and style of his current administration. On January 5th, 1970, a second meeting is held between members of the Club of Rome, the PMW, Trudeau, and senior Liberals. 4 attendees of this meeting, including R.J. Whitehead and others, became the first Canadian members of the Club of Rome. When Whitehead expressed hesitation about a potential conflict of interest, Trudeau personally assured him that his membership was compatible with his responsibilities as principal science advisor in the Privy Council office, because it would allow Trudeau to keep in touch with the activities of the Club of Rome. Canada was one of the first countries to create a national association for the Club of Rome. On April 6, 1971, the Trudeau government sponsored the Club of Rome's second full meeting, held in Montebello, Quebec. Members of Trudeau's cabinet, the PMW, the PCO, and the Governor General attended. This meeting was a critical moment in the development of the Club of Rome's thinking. It was at Montebello that the concept of limits to growth was first conceived and discussed, 1 year before the book was published. Canada was not just a bystander. Canada was in the room when the blueprint for global degrowth was being drawn up, and Pierre Trudeau put them there. The Department of the Environment, or DOE, was created on January 27, 1971. The first Minister of Environment was Jack Davis, and he declared that the new department would put ecology ahead of economics wherever a choice had to be made between the two. But the DOE was not designed to be a normal ministry. It was designed to be a horizontal organization, meaning it would review the initiatives of all other departments that affected the environment and report directly to Cabinet. It was a surveillance and control mechanism embedded inside the government itself. The Ministry of State for Science and Technology, or MOSST, this ministry was conceived and molded by system thinkers and Club of Rome members, specifically J.R. Whitehead and C.R. Nixon from the Privy Council office. Whitehead, remember, was one of the first Canadian members of the Club of Rome. He became the Assistant Secretary for MOSST. MOSST became, in the paper's own words, a major sponsor of Club of Rome and Canadian Association for the Club of Rome initiatives, funding Club of Rome reports directly with Canadian taxpayer money. Then the Ministry of State for Urban Affairs, or MSUA, became because Trudeau had declared that urbanization was one of the 2 major sources of pollution threatening human survival. Now, alongside these 3 institutions, Trudeau also overhauled Statistics Canada. In 1972, he appointed Sylvia Austrie as chief statistician and charged her with augmenting the national accounts to include social welfare and environmental impacts, the early architecture of what we now call the well-being economy. A group was created inside Statistics Canada specifically to research ways to interrelate orthodox economic statistics with environmental indicators. In other words, to replace GDP with a measurement that the government controls and defines. And why does that matter? Because whoever controls the measurement controls the narrative. If you can redefine prosperity, if you can say that GDP doesn't measure what really matters, and that what really matters is this new index that we've invented, then you can tell people that they're prosperous while their standard of living collapses. You can tell them that they have well-being while they're literally freezing in the dark. And this is not hypothetical, this is the explicit goal, and it was being built into Canadian institutions in 1971 and 1972, over 50 years ago. Now let's talk about the intellectual foundation of all of this, Limits to Growth, published in 1972 by the Club of Rome, based on computer modeling done by a team at MIT led by Jay Forrester. The model used 5 variables: pollution, food, production, industrialization, pollution, and consumption of non-renewable natural resources. It captured what they called the non-linear relationships and feedbacks between these variables to produce scenarios out to the year 2100. The conclusion, without changes to historical growth trends, was sudden and uncontrollable decline in both population and industrial capacity. They predicted we would run out of copper by the year 2000. They predicted mass starvation. They predicted civilizational collapse driven by resource exhaustion. None of this happened either. And here's where their model was always going to be wrong. When a resource becomes scarce, it becomes expensive. When it becomes expensive, there's a massive incentive for innovation. Whoever figures out a substitute, a workaround, or a more efficient extraction method becomes extraordinarily wealthy. That incentive structure, built into free markets, is the engine of human progress. The Club of Rome's models assume a static world. They assume that if we were using X amount of copper in 1972, we would keep using X amount of copper forever with no innovation, no substitution, no efficiency gains. That's not how markets work. That's not how human ingenuity works. But here's the thing, the Club of Rome doesn't actually care that their predictions are wrong because the predictions are not the point. The fear is the point. The urgency is the point. The justification for control is the point. Every time the predictions fail, they simply rewrite the models, extend the deadlines, and publish a new edition. We are now on what is effectively the 5th iteration of Limits to Growth. The latest version is called Earth for All, a survival guide for humanity, published in 2022 with a deep dive paper released in May 2024. And every single time, the World Economic Forum, the United Nations, and their government partners treat it as gospel. The Club of Rome has been pushing degrowth and systems transformation for 50 years. They've had partners in the UN, the World Economic Forum, and the governments of Western nations. They've had billions of dollars in funding. They have had media support, academic support, and institutional support. And they still haven't achieved their goals. So now they're starting to turn inward. They're saying that the reason their agenda hasn't been fully implemented is not because it's wrong, it's because people's values haven't been transformed yet. I can hear a creepy PMO book with that title come to mind when I think about that. The document states, and I'm quoting directly, that it seeks to address the human inner dimension reckoning with the deep collective structures of thought foundational to failing systems and nurturing the inner capacities necessary to overcome barriers to collective action and structural transformation. I want you to remember these words. Collective. We need to brainwash people into accepting our agenda is what they're telling you. They're explicit about this. They talk about transforming worldviews, mindsets, values, and identity as the root drivers of cultural behavior. They talk about psychological and behavioral tendencies, which is operant conditioning, B.F. Skinner style behavior modification, ring the bell, make you recycle, ring the bell, make you downsize your house. They talk about spiritual sensibility and existential inquiry. They quote the Islamic Declaration on Global Climate Change. They reference Thich Nhat Hanh. They talk about Ubuntu philosophy and indigenous wisdoms. They're building a synthetic global religion, one that just happens to require you to accept degrowth, collectivism, and the surrender of your individual sovereignty. And here's the legal argument that I think is critical, particularly for Canadians, but it's relevant everywhere. So there's a legal scholar named Ben Clement, I believe in the late 1980s. He reviewed all First Amendment jurisprudence on the Establishment Clause and identified 3 characteristics of religion for legal purposes. Why do we exist? What is my relationship to the world that will persist beyond my lifetime? What are our responsibilities towards the collective? That is a comprehensive system of belief. It answers fundamental questions about the world and man's role in it, and it inspires duties of conscience, specifically the duty to accept degrowth, reduce your consumption, share your bedroom, and surrender your standard of living. This is a religion, and it is being imposed on Western populations through government policy, corporate pressure, and nonprofit coordination. The document also outlines 5 extraordinary turnarounds required to avoid this impending collapse that's never happened. Ending poverty, addressing inequality, empowering women, transforming energy systems, transforming food systems. Now notice that 4 and 5, energy and food, are the most fundamental levers of control over any population. If you control energy and food and you control people, this is not a coincidence. This is the point. And they call for a giant leap, their words, in socioeconomic transformation. A giant leap, like Mao's Great Leap Forward, except instead of leaping forward into industrial production, we are leaping backward, out of production, out of prosperity, out of freedom, and into what they call sufficiency and well-being. Now let's bring this into the present day because Pierre Trudeau is gone, but his agenda is not. Enter Christina Freeland, Deputy Prime Minister, Minister of Finance for Canada, was, and a straightforward operative of the World Economic Forum. In 2023, Freeland gave a commencement speech at Northeastern University in which she told graduates, and I'm quoting, that they were living through an inflection point, a time of transformation that comes once every 5 or 6 generations. She said the fundamental question being asked around kitchen tables is, in Canada and the United States, does capitalist democracy still work? Now, why would a sitting Deputy Prime Minister be asking whether the economic and political system of her own country still works? Because that's the Club of Rome's question. That is the World Economic Forum's question. The answer they want, the answer that they are engineering, is no. And they're engineering that answer by deliberately creating the conditions that make it look true. The housing crisis created by unsustainable immigration policy, the youth unemployment crisis created by prioritizing immigrant employment over Canadian-born workers, a form of affirmative action for immigrants, the economic stagnation created by energy restrictions that deliberately suppress Canada's most productive industries. This is the Cloward Piven strategy. Deliberately overloading the system to create a crisis that justifies radical transformation. You break the system, you blame the system, and then you replace the system. Then in 2016, Freeland stood at the Davos World Economic Forum annual meeting and announced a new platform called Convergence, designed to bring together public, private, and philanthropic sectors to invest together in emerging market projects. The Canadian government contributed $23.5 million of taxpayer money, and the platform was to be hosted in Toronto. Public, private, philanthropic, converging into a single coordinated entity. This is stakeholder capitalism, the WEF's rebranding of what is functionally a corporate government nonprofit cartel. It is the same convergence that Christina Freeland's Earth for All document describes. It's the same convergence that Pierre Trudeau was building with the DOE, MOSST, and MS 1971. The names change, but the institutions change, the language changes, the agenda does not. And let's talk about the mass line, because understanding this technique is essential to understanding what is happening in Canada right now. The mass line, is a propaganda and political mobilization technique perfected by the Chinese Communist Party. Here's how it works in 5 steps. The party identifies a policy it wants to implement. Step 2, the party manufactures the appearance of grassroots demand for that policy. Step 3, the party amplifies the manufactured demand through media, social media, and institutional channels until it appears to be a massive public consensus. Step 4, the party presents the policy as a response to public demand, not as a top-down imposition. 5, anyone who resists is framed as opposing the will of the people. Now apply that to the Empty Bedrooms campaign in Canada. The pressure for people to turn their homes into apartment blocks. Step 1, the Liberal government wants to redistribute housing to accommodate the immigration levels it has created. Step 2, narratives begin appearing across Canadian social media about the moral problem of these empty bedrooms, too much space, you have a whole yard to yourself. Elderly Canadians are framed as hoarding space, grandparents are pressured to downsize. Step 3, the Liberals began talking about streamlining the housing industry, modular homes, shipping container homes, and the need for everyone to pitch in and do their part. Step 4, the policy is framed not as a government seizure, but as a community response to a housing crisis, a crisis the government created. Step 5, anyone who says, that is my private property and you can't have it, is framed as selfish, as anti-community, as a bigot, as standing in the way of helping vulnerable immigrants. Step 6, private property removal by weaponizing First Nation narratives and systemic social shaming via sins of the father. This is Mao's land reform. The target is your farm, your property. The target's your money. Now, I want to take a moment to highlight what's happening in Alberta. Alberta, in my view, is the most awake and most actively resistant province in Canada. Albertans understand what is being done to them. They understand that the energy restrictions being imposed on the province are not about the environment at all, it's about control. They're about suppressing the most productive, most prosperous, most independent part of Canada. Because here's the thing about energy. Canada is a country where it routinely gets to 20 to 40 degrees below zero. Energy is not a luxury in Canada. Energy is survival. When you restrict energy production in Canada, you're not making a political statement, you're threatening people's lives. The Club of Rome's agenda, the degrowth agenda, when applied to a country like Canada, does not produce a pleasant, sustainable, equitable future. It produces people freezing to death in the dark while they starve. That's not hyperbole. It is the logical endpoint of restricting energy production in one of the coldest inhabited places on Earth. Albertans know this. They're organized, they're fighting back, they're doing the things that actually work, not just screaming into the void, but building political structures, supporting independent media, and refusing to comply with a federal government that has been working against their interests for 50 years. Alberta's proof that resistance is possible. Instead of people fighting Alberta, they should be taking notes. Alberta's proof that Canadians can fight back. And Alberta should be an inspiration to every single province in this country. We should all be separating from Ottawa. There's a distinction worth making clearly. Outright communism, state ownership of all means of production, forced collectivization, is not what's being formally proposed. What is being built is something arguably way more dangerous because it's harder to name. It's a coordinated public-private nonprofit cartel that achieves the same ends through softer mechanisms. Fabian socialism, stakeholder capitalism, call it whatever you want, and under new NDP leader AUDIUS, the party has moved dramatically left. What else did we hear? If you think this is crazy talk, government-run grocery stores. Lewis is proposing a nationwide chain of publicly owned grocery stores, modeled as a nonprofit public service, starting with 50 stores. Toronto approved a pilot program for 4 municipally run stores in March 2026. Lewis wants to expand this federally. He has explicitly cited Mexico's state-run stores as a model. This is a textbook state control of food supply, one of the 5 extraordinary turnarounds the Club of Rome identified as a key lever of control. AUDIUS also wants government-run internet and telecom. When the government controls your communication infrastructure, it controls what you say, what you can access, and who you can organize with. We're also seeing federal public housing. So Carney launched Build Canada Homes in September 2025 with $13 billion in initial capital, targeting 250,000 new units by 2031. The government is unlocking 90 federal properties, 473 hectares for housing development under long-term leases. The land stays publicly owned. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is the government becoming the landlord of Canada. Lewis wants to go further, 1 million social co-op nonprofit homes in 5 years. This should be up to the private sector. And we've even seen at that NDP convention calling each other comrades. This is not accidental language. This is ideological signaling, normalizing the vocabulary of Marxists organizing within a mainstream political party. When elected officials use the word comrade in parliamentary or public settings, they are telling you exactly what framework they're operating from. Mark Carney is a more sophisticated threat than you realize. He's not a street-level socialist. He is something way more dangerous. He's a globalist technocrat who uses the language of markets and pragmatism to implement the same agenda through financial architecture. He should concern Canadians a lot. He literally wrote the book on stakeholder capitalism. In his 2021 book Values, Building a Better World for All is a direct argument that market values must be subordinated to societal values, defined and enforced by government, central banks, and international institutions. This is the intellectual foundation of the West stakeholder capitalism model. He's not theorizing. He's now implementing it as Prime Minister. Then we have GFANZ, the financial arm of the climate agenda. Carney was co-chair of the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, a coalition designed to redirect trillions of dollars of private capital away from fossil fuels and towards net zero investments. This is not a government program, it is a private financial cartel coordinating investment decisions across the global banking system to achieve political goals. Canada's Big Five banks exited GFANZ in 2025, which tells you something about how untenable the pressure was becoming. But Carney's now Prime Minister with a majority government, and he can apply that pressure through regulation and policy instead. And while Carney canceled the consumer carbon tax, he strengthened the output-based pricing system for industry and mandated a 2026 federal review to force provinces like Alberta to harmonize their carbon pricing upward toward the federal $95 per ton level. This is a direct attack on Alberta's energy competitiveness, dressed up as environmental policy. Then, of course, we have the Canada-China Strategic Reset, the new alliance. This is arguably the most alarming recent development. In January 2026, Carney traveled to China and forged a new strategic partnership covering energy, trade, agriculture, and low-carbon economy. Even analysis sympathetic to the move acknowledged that Canada's limited strategic autonomy in this relationship, meaning China understands it is getting a close U.S. ally to pivot toward Beijing. This is not trade diversification. This is Canada being repositioned as a bridge for Chinese influence into North America. Exactly the concern raised in the knowledge base about a communist country on America's northern border. Carney gave a special address at Davos in January 2026. He's not This was at the World Economic Forum annual meeting. He's not distancing himself from the WEF. He's their man in Ottawa, the same WEF that has been cross-pollinating with the Club of Rome since 1971. So there's a big pattern here, and what it all leads up to is levers. So food, we have government grocery stores, industrial carbon prices raise food costs, forcing complete dependency. When it comes to housing, we have 1 million public units. Government is now your landlord. When it comes to energy, we have a full green transition, no oil and gas, OBPS carbon pricing, net zero architecture. Finances, we have wealth taxes and higher capital gains. We have them taking over communications. We have them making relationships with China, with NATO, with Davos and WEF. And the values are openly socialist, stakeholder capitalism, values-based markets. The NDP is the accelerationist version. Carney is the technocratic version. Both lead to the same place, a Canada where the government controls the fundamental inputs of daily life: food, housing, energy, money, communications. The NDP calling each other comrades and proposing government grocery stores is easy to see and easy to mock, so much so that it's almost a distraction. The harder thing to see, and the more important thing to see, is that Mark Carney is building the financial and regulatory architecture that makes the NDP's overt socialism unnecessary. When the government controls carbon pricing, housing supply, ESG disclosure requirements, and has a strategic partnership with the Chinese Communist Party, you don't need to call the grocery store government-owned. You just need to make it impossible for private grocers to operate outside your framework. That is the Fabian method. That is the Club of Rome method. And that is what is being built in Canada right now. So let me be very direct about what's the end goal of this agenda, because the Club of Rome's 2024 document is very honest about it. They want you to become what they call a new man, a sustainable, inclusive, globally conscious citizen who has undergone what they call inner transformation, a fundamental remolding of your values, your identity, your spiritual orientation, and your relationship to the collective. They want you to stop valuing individual prosperity. They want you to stop valuing private property. They want you to stop valuing national identity. They want you to stop valuing your own family's well-being above the collective well-being. The social conditioning we saw around woke narratives over the last 10 years was to prime you to accept, even giving up your land. They want you to believe that your standard of living is the problem, that your energy consumption is the problem, that your spare bedroom is the problem, that your GDP measured prosperity is the problem. And they want you to willingly surrender all of it, not because soldiers are forcing you, but because you have been spiritually and psychologically transformed to believe that surrender is virtue. I don't think I need to point out that those in charge believe in luxury and opulence for themselves. They just want you to accept this new way of living. I think Mark Carney's bill on the airplane for food and drink was over $500,000. This is what Mao called ideological remolding. This is what the Soviet Union called creating the new Soviet man. And this is what the Club of Rome calls cultivating the inner capacities necessary for collective action. Different words, same program, same destination. And I'm sorry, leftists, the destination is not a sustainable, equitable, beautiful world. The destination is poverty, dependence, and top-down control. So what do you do with all of this that I laid out? And again, thank you, James Lindsay, for the bulk of this research. I don't know how you do it. I had to reshare this information. But, you know, guys, share this episode. The most powerful thing you can do right now is to make sure that Canadians understand history. The Liberals have been counting on Canadians not knowing this, and sunlight is the best disinfectant. Also start to understand this language every time you hear the words transformative, systems approach, well-being economy, sufficiency, collective action, interdimension, stakeholder capitalism, convergence, or planetary limits. You are hearing the language of this agenda. Recognize it, name it, refuse to be moved by it. Third, you got to reject the mass line. When you see coordinated narratives about empty bedrooms, about the moral failure of capitalism, about the need for everyone to pitch in and sacrifice more, about giving up your property, recognize it as manufactured consensus. It's not organic, it's not grassroots, it's a political operation, and it's not needed. We are in the most resource-rich nation on earth. Fourth, protect your energy. In Canada, energy is not a political issue. Energy is survival. Any policy that restricts Canadian energy production is a policy that threatens Canadian lives. Treat it accordingly. And last but not least, look at Alberta. Study what they're doing, support what they're doing, replicate what they're doing in your own province. Organized, strategic, effective resistance is possible, and Alberta is proving it. And I know you guys don't feel like your vote probably counts right now with that stolen majority, but please continue to participate. I know it doesn't feel very effective, but if you don't participate, I can promise you it will get worse. The Liberal Party has been running this agenda for over 50 years. The NDP is worse. These are not parties with different approaches to the same goals. These are parties that are actively working to dismantle the Canadian standard of living, Canadian energy dependence, Canadian private property rights, and Canadian sovereignty, in service to a global agenda that was cooked up in a villa in Rome, 1968. You have the power to stop this, but only if you know what you're stopping. That's it for this episode of The Sovereign Sphere today. If you stayed with me till the end, bravo, you guys. Let me know in the comments, because this was a long haul. My tongue is in knots. Like Pierre Trudeau, Club of Rome, Limits to Growth, Department of Environment, all of these things. A lot of this is probably brand new information, and this is huge. You might even need to, if you want to nerd out on this like me, you might want to listen to it again. But this agenda, it's been going on for 50 years and it's not finished. But neither are you and me. Do not let them disempower you or get in your head. Canada is worth fighting for, and the first step in fighting for it is knowing the truth. I'm your host, Carla Treadway. This is The Sovereign Sphere. Share this episode. Stay sovereign. Stay critical. I'll link up James Lindsay's original resources in the comment section. If you guys are curious, definitely go and check that out. And I'll see you for another episode soon. Hit that subscribe button. Join me on Substack where we can interact a little bit. That helps me a ton, and I'd love to hear your thoughts a bit more. But as always, friends, thank you, and I'll see you soon.